This is part 5 of our series on Catholic social teaching, which is centered around 7 major principles, and we've already covered the first 2 principles. Number 1, the dignity of human life, and number 2, community. And today we're going to be talking about the 3rd principle of Catholic social teaching, which is rights and responsibilities. Sounds thrilling. Catholic tradition teaches that rights and responsibilities, you can think of them as 2 sides to the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And so we must organize our societies to protect these human rights, but we also have to meet the responsibilities that come with those rights. And only when we do both can we ensure the dignity of the human person and the health of the community. Like nearly all things Catholic, it's not an either or, it's a both and type thing. And so it requires some nuance. Pope Benedict XVI, he wisely summarized what happens when we only focus on one thing over the other when it comes to rights and responsibilities. He says, an overemphasis on rights leads to a disregard for responsibilities. The sharing of reciprocal responsibilities is a more powerful incentive to action than the mere assertion of rights. So what he's saying here is that if all we focus on our rights, we tend to become only focused on rights and not our response to those rights. We tend to become entitled, and we tend to neglect our duties to society. And we see this come to its ultimate conclusion, as Pope Benedict says, individual rights, when detached from a framework of responsibilities that grants them their full meaning, can run wild, leading to an escalation of demands which is effectively unlimited and indiscriminate. So when rights simply becomes, give me more and more, we end up with, the wealthiest human population in history that claim to have a right to all the excesses and all the vices in the world, when at the same time we see that there's lack of food and lack of drinking water and basic instruction and healthcare in some areas of the world. And we tend to think, well, that's just the way the world is. But that would be to ignore our responsibilities in light of our God-given rights. So what are the rights of the human person as outlined by the Church? Well, we already know that the first principle of Catholic social teaching is the life and dignity of the human person. So it should come as no surprise that the most fundamental right is the right to life. St. John Paul II said that the right to health, to home, to work, to family, to culture is false and illusory if the right to life, the most basic and fundamental right, and the condition for all other personal rights is not defended with maximum determination. So that should be our first priority. And then from the right to life flows all the other things required for human decency. When the dignity of the human person is respected and rights are recognized and guaranteed, it allows a society to flourish. Now, to be clear, these rights, they're not just made up. They're based off of the natural law, which I talked about months ago now at this point. But the natural law, is the law that is written into the human person. We look at the human person, and who the human person is, what the person is, tells us something about how they ought to be treated. And as Catholics, this puts a limit on what we even consider to be rights. Essentially, if it doesn't come to us naturally, then it's not a legitimate right. So like the debate to the right of gender reassignment surgery, for example, it's not a right because it's not based on natural law, it's an artificial right. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII wrote a letter called Rerum Novarum, which is Latin for new things. And this letter became the first of what are now referred to as the social encyclicals. And his aim in this letter was to address the effects of the Industrial Revolution. At that time, factory conditions were horrific and unsafe. Children were hired to be basically slave labor next to free labor. Workers had very little rights, and they were often exploited by the so-called robber barons, who were titans of industry who profited enormously off of the technological revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. Alfred Nobel is one of them. Carnegie, Vanderbilt, all these guys. Nobel was so rich that he invented the Nobel Peace Prize to give away $1 million to the winner every year, and he's been dead for almost 100 years, so he's still that rich. Pope Leo XIII, he spoke of things like workers' rights and the right to private property and a living wage and moral and cultural values. And then in 1963, St. John the 23rd spoke of the right to worship according to one's, conscience. So he spoke about religious freedom. He spoke about the right to immigrate, to find better opportunities. St. John the 23rd, he also outlined, basic human rights like food and clothing and shelter and medical care and social services. He also said that we have a right to be cared for when it comes to an event of ill health or a disability, or like widowhood or old age or unemployment or whenever through no fault of your own you lose work. And then in 1991, on the 100th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's original social encyclical, St. John Paul II wrote in his encyclical, which is titled 100 Years Later, referring to the 100th anniversary of this Pope, he recognized the right to private initiative and private property. And so ever since Pope Leo XIII in his first encyclical, the popes have elaborated on and expanded our understanding of human rights, which now include civil, political, social, cultural, economic, religious freedoms. Our current Pope, Leo XIV, he specifically chose that name, Leo, because he wants to address social issues such as human dignity and the rights of workers that are being impacted in ways that Pope Leo XIII could have never predicted in Rerum Novarum, specifically with advancing technology and AI. The robber barons, they never went away. They just turned into people who live in Silicon Valley. They would turn into profit-obsessed companies and economies that don't hesitate to exploit or discard or even kill human beings. But with rights also come responsibilities. For example, in order for the right of the individual ownership of private property to work, it requires the responsibility of others to recognize that private property. And to respect that right. And this not only applies to individuals, it applies to corporations and governments. They have a right to respond to the human person appropriately. Society has an obligation to recognize and to protect these rights. The government has a responsibility to recognize those rights as well. Society is ordered to the individual because the person is the ultimate end of society. It is meant to serve the individual, not the other way around. People aren't meant to serve the government or corporations, but rather the institutions of society are meant to serve the dignity of the human person. And when a society refuses to recognize the rights of a person, it loses moral authority and moral legitimacy. Which is why the church officially condemns forms of government that prioritize the collective or the state above all else, including over the individual. Now, Jesus makes it clear that respect for the rights of others flows from the call to look upon our neighbor as ourself. Our concern shouldn't be, who qualifies as our neighbor or who is worthy or deserving of rights. Rather, Jesus teaches that it is a responsibility to make oneself a neighbor to others and actively serve them by honoring them and defending the fundamental rights that they have just by virtue of existing. You can't say, I have the right to so-and-so or such and such, while at the same time ignoring the people around us. Just look at today's gospel. There was great crowds of people, and the disciples, they're essentially like, not my problem. See you later. Go away. Go find your own food. And Jesus is like, no, actually, yes, it is your problem. And we're going to fix the problem because they are your neighbor. And this is a consistent theme throughout all of Scripture. Leviticus teaches us that when someone is reduced to poverty, we have an obligation to help. In the book of Ruth, Boaz cares for Ruth, and Ruth is a widow and a foreigner, and he gives her far more than law requires. And guess what? Ruth is listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in St. Matthew's Gospel. If it weren't for someone caring for a poor widowed immigrant, then we wouldn't have Jesus. The book of Tobit tells us to give from what we have received and do not turn away from the poor. Isaiah tells us to seek justice, to rescue the oppressed, to defend the orphan, to plead for the widow. Jeremiah tells us that a legitimate government upholds the rights of the poor and the vulnerable. In the parable of Lazarus and the rich man ends up in hell because he didn't do anything to help Lazarus, who was begging at his door. Jesus himself says, "As you did to the least of these, you did unto me." And so in some cases where we're tempted to think, it's not my problem, maybe it is our problem. Because it sounds like a good deal of our personal judgment is going to be based on how well or how poorly we treated the marginalized, which we're going to get into next week. Because that's where I'm going to leave things for today. I was on retreat this week and I decided to take a nap and read a book instead of write more homilies. So next week we'll get back to talk about the fourth principle of Catholic social teaching, which is how to treat the poor.